G'day, I'm Stephen Page from Page Probe Family and Fertility Lawyers, and you're listening and watching the Australian Family and Fertility Law podcast. What I'm talking about today is why a Human Rights Act is vital when it comes to IVF and surrogacy in Australia. You might think, well, we're a really good country when it comes to human rights, and in general terms, we are. But one of the features about Australia is that we are the only Western common law country that does not have a Human Rights Act or Bill of Rights of some kind. If we look at similar countries, for example, Canada, the United States, the UK and New Zealand, they all have them. We don't. And if we look at our states, we have a Human Rights Act or human rights laws now in the ACT, Queensland and Victoria, but not in New South Wales or Tasmania or South Australia or the Northern Territory or Western Australia. And your reaction to that might be, well, so what? We have the common law. We should be very proud of the common law because it certainly upholds rights. That's true, but the common law can easily be overridden by Parliament, and that's happened time and time again. But what I'm going to focus on is why is it important that there is a Human Rights Act when it comes to IVF and surrogacy. Now, in a separate video, I talk about how human rights relate to surrogacy, and in a post on my website, I go into great length about human rights that are implicated with surrogacy, and I won't go into that level of detail today. But I'll say this, the thinking that human rights only relates to citizens being imprisoned and persecuted by governments really doesn't deal with the creation of children. You would think that they're not related, but what we've seen is that they are related. And an example is that currently there is a judgment pending from the Queensland Court of Appeal. Ms. Smith is a prisoner in Queensland, and she wants to be able to freeze her eggs so that when she gets out of jail, she can have a child or have the option of having a child. The likelihood is that by the time she gets out of jail, if she then seeks to use her eggs at that point, she'll be too old. And she's run the case not so much on the Human Rights Act, but dealing with the Queensland Corrective Services Act, which says, in effect, that she cannot engage in assisted reproductive treatment, a term that's not defined, or assisted reproductive technology, if I get it correct, not defined in the legislation, but the primary judge held that the freezing of eggs was assisted reproductive technology. What she didn't do was to argue about rights to privacy, the rights to found a family, etc., because there's certainly case law overseas, and I discuss it very briefly in the other video concerning that. The legal profession, rightfully, is a very conservative profession, but one thing that I have noticed, because I have had this strong international connections with colleagues overseas since at least 2011, is that overseas there is a much more focused approach on human rights and how human rights implicate this particular journey. And why is that the case? Well, because it's part of the statute law. And we don't have it as part of the statute law. If it were there, then rather than being in the background boiling one, oh yeah, that's right. It's more, here it is, we should be dealing with it. How does this implicate this particular journey? How are these human rights connected with this approach? And what we've seen from decisions, for example, from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the Supreme Court of Mexico, the Constitutional Court of Colombia, is that rights concerning the surrogate, the child, and the intended parents all come to play, at least in the approach to surrogacy. And by the European Court of Human Rights and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights about there being a right to access assisted reproductive treatment, and in respect to the Inter-American Court, the right to access surrogacy. So I think it's important that we do have a Human Rights Act in Australia because it does impact. I'm quite proud that I managed to persuade the then Attorney General of South Australia, Vicky Chapman, when there was an exposure draft of what became the Surrogacy Act 2019, that there was a specific naming of human rights in that Act. So that Act now says, because of my advocacy and evidently her approval, that the principles include the consideration of how the human rights of all concerned with the surrogacy arrangement are taken into account, including that of the child. Because there was a lot of focus on human rights about the surrogate and, to a lesser extent, that of the child, but nothing about the intended parents. Now, I've acted for surrogates, and certainly I want to make sure that the human rights of children are protected. But everyone during the surrogacy journey has human rights, and all of those human rights, as far as possible, should be respected and protected. Because I've certainly seen shocking cases in the past from overseas where everyone was exploited. And one case that stands out to me was a case from India about 15 years ago, where the doctor, who also turns out was a surrogacy agent, did very well out of the deal, but the surrogate was exploited. Actually, there were two surrogates, both were exploited. Presumably, the intended parents, well, I should say the intended parents were exploited, and at the child at the other end had probably no idea about how they came into existence, or certainly no honest explanation ultimately by the doctor about how that child came into existence. So it's important that there are human rights specifically named in statute in Australia and hopefully enforceable. So my hope is that we do have a Human Rights Act in Australia. How it'll play out in the context of IVF and surrogacy, it's too early to tell. But the idea that we shouldn't have one, I think, is just a mistake. It's letting everyone down. Thank you for watching and listening to the Australian Family and Fertility Law podcast. I'm Stephen Page from Page Pravin Family and Fertility Lawyers in Brisbane.